and welcome to the final day of the 2014 Aare nzare Conference. I think we're all looking pretty fit and toned after scampering up and down the stairs to attend our various sessions, but it's good to see that we've carefully balanced this with the delightful wee spas and chocolate eclairs at morning and afternoon tea. Now, when you came in, you might have noticed the camera over here. It's a time-lapse camera, and it's going to be used to show the auditorium filling up really quickly. So this wonderful man over here is an artist, so I hope no one did anything naughty when they came in this morning. So highlights for today include the presentation of the Radford lecture, and we'll hear more about our wonderful keynote presenter very soon. Presentation of 3 awards, your wonderful presentations, of course. 7 featured symposia from a competitive process, and they'll be running from 1:30 to 3 o'clock today. And we also have a closing ceremony. It's very important for this wonderful object to be given back to New Zealand, to go back the spirit of New Zealand. And it has been such a delight to host the joint conference with our New Zealand colleagues this year. And I believe the conference has been greatly enriched by their presence and the collaboration that we've had with them. So those who attended the AGM yesterday for Aare will know that our wonderful President, Julianne, finished her term of office, and we now have a new President. So just before I introduce our new President, I'd just like to thank Julianne. There's Julianne. Okay, she's in the back row, ready to run. Julianne's done an absolutely wonderful job in her 2 years and has left a fantastic legacy for us. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Martin Mills, the new President of Aare, to commence the formal proceedings. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal, Yagara, Kabi Kabi and Jinnabura people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that this land has been and always will be a place of learning and teaching. I took over the presidency yesterday, and I think one of the sweeteners is you get to do really lovely things on the first day. And I'd like to endorse Margaret's comments in relation to Julianne. I thanked Julianne yesterday at the AGM. There's a few more people here today than there were at the AGM. So I'd like to just reinforce those comments and say personal thanks to Julianne. Also, would like to thank someone else. Once Aare gets its hooks into you, you very rarely ever let go. One of those people is Jan Wright, a former president of Aare, who has been trying for years to, get a little bit of space, but every year since she took on the role of organising the conference, we've managed to get her involved in some way. And this year, she took on the enormous task of programming over 800 plus papers. It might seem like an easy task, but it is anything but. So Jan, we do just have a little gift for you just to say thanks very much. If you could come down, I'll give that to you. Thanks. The next task, and I guess my first formal task, is to introduce the Radford lecture. And I have to say it gives me enormous pleasure to do this. On multiple levels. The lecture is for a distinguished figure in the area relevant to educational research. And if you look at the list of people who have delivered the Radford lecture in the past, it's a very, very impressive list. One of the things that we've been asked, the President is always asked to do, is to say something a little bit about about Radford, Bill Radford. And I feel quite, I've been reading a little bit over the last few days about him and feel reasonably emotional to some extent. I feel very, very lucky having arrived on a boat from England in 1972 in about September, October. Lucky on one hand because it was just prior to the Whitlam government and all of my schooling was done at high school under virtually the Whitlam government apart from the last year. It was also lucky in the sense that 1972 was the year that the Radford system was introduced into Queensland schools. It's a system that many people who work in the field of assessment recognise as being the beginnings of a world-class assessment system that's operating in Queensland, which is teacher-based, teacher-driven, teacher-moderated, and based primarily in schools. I think that what touched me was reading. So I began my schooling in that period, but Bill Radford met an untimely death in 1976 in November, which was the month that I actually finished my high school in Queensland, and will feel forever grateful that I went through a school system that was teacher moderated. Bill Radford was, despite having a major impact upon Queensland education, was a Victorian and had been heavily involved in education. He came from an education family. His parents were teachers, his wife was a teacher, and he was a junior teacher. But he went on to do his PhD in the field of rural education and policy, and became the director of ACER in 1955. But he was also involved in the formation of AARE in 1970, and was an executive member from that time, and then became president in 1974, and as I indicated, died in 1976. He was an academic who was, to some extent, might have liked the current ARC's focus on impact, in that he was very, very concerned with translating educational research into practice and for it to having some effect on schools. He was also committed to the professionalisation of teachers and to supporting students in poverty. I think the commitment that he demonstrated or expressed in relation to social justice has been a strong element, that's a strong theme of Radford lectures. When I look back to see who has presented Radford lectures, I see many of the leading figures in or educational researchers concerned with social justice, which brings me to introducing Terry. Look, I'm thrilled, absolutely thrilled to be introducing Terry. For as long as I can remember coming to AARE conferences, from the very first one where I still feel guilty about for sneaking into the conference dinner without paying as a PhD student. I do owe AARE some things. Terry has been around at AARE and has been a strong presence. I will read Terry's the statement in relation to Terry and then just say a couple of other things. So Professor Terry Seddon is Professor of Leadership Studies at the Australian Catholic University, Melbourne. Her research examined education and educational work in global transitions, focusing particularly on workplace learning and leadership in tertiary, adult and post-compulsory education. This research program in historical sociology and political geography asks questions about knowledge and authority in societies, schooling and emerging lifelong learning spaces, and how educators use these resources to make spaces for learning that form citizens. She was a member of the Australian Research Council College of Experts on the panel for Social, Behavioural and Economic Sciences, and also the 2010 Australian Research Assessment Excellence for Research in Australia. Like Tracy yesterday with Graham Smith, that's the formal part. Just something on Terry, and one of the problems when you do searches for people on their CVs and on the web is you don't get the personal things that people do. So clearly, from my knowledge of Terry, some of which is on the web, for instance, her great contribution to the report in response to the very first ERA exercise, Living in a 2.2 World, which was an amazing report and well worth having a look at. It's a response to the ERA assessment, which suggested that Australian research was well below, with an average weighting, well below world standard, which we clearly know is not the case. Terry has been on the executive and has been research development coordinator. I also know from my own PhD students, when Terry was invited to come to UQ to work with our research higher degree students for our postgraduate conference, that she came and gave so generously of her time. And I think about that one event and think, I wonder how many other events that people don't know about that Terry does to support research higher degree and the research community in Australia. So Terry, it gives me absolute pleasure to welcome you to give the lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can we put it up on the floor? Oh, it is up. Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking, you don't want to see all that crap around the edge. Okay, I'll focus now. Sorry about this, everyone. Okay, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are gathered here together. I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present and emerging. But I'd also like to acknowledge the elders that we carry with us as we come here to this transnational space of educational research, located in Australia, but not of Australia, because indeed we are many from many lands. We carry elders from those places. And what we do at these conferences, I think, is share that together. I think that's important to remember. I'd like to thank Aare for the invitation to give this lecture. I am very honoured by the invitation, partly because while I have been around Aare, in fact I became a member in 1979, my participation has been quite erratic for a range of reasons. And so, you know, it's nice to be, thank you, it's nice to know that you exist in the space, as it were. My agenda today is in some ways captured by the image that you see on the screen. I actually started off thinking about this term, navigating 21st century contexts, and Googled the word, where are we? And this image came up. I thought it was really great because it captured for me both the sense of uncertainty and the kind of feeling that one's hurtling towards the future, a future that is unknown, that is uncertain, that in some respects is potentially quite dangerous. And I think those sentiments have, in a way, framed the work that I certainly am doing now. And I think, too, they raise issues about the role and the purpose of education that we do well to dwell on. When I looked at the, you know, you can go back behind the image and find out where the website came from, where the image came from. When I did this, I actually found that this image came out of a gun network in the US. And in fact, at that point, this sense of the uncertainty and the hurtling towards the future kind of took on a slightly different hue. I felt slightly nervous about using a gun. It wasn't a lobby, it was you know, the shooter's lifestyle. It was the podcast. I felt slightly uncomfortable using this image in some ways. But I think it also actually underlines the fact that The uncertainty, the racing towards the future, the sense of apocalypse that we have, I think, today, and we can in some ways see in our Commonwealth government here in Australia, actually drives all sorts of erratic behaviours. And I think this is also why I would say education has an important role to play, even if we are subject to the discourse of derision, even if we are not valued for the research that we do. I think that the work we do, both in terms of our knowledge and practice, is important. And I want to really underline that. And I think if there's one thing we need to do, it's to claim that. And I guess, in a way, one of the questions I'm puzzling with at the moment is how you do that. Informally, I also want to kind of acknowledge that my thinking about this lecture has been slightly existential, to be quite frank. I was interested in Martin's comments about coming to Australia in 1972. I came in 1975. I was a bit older than Martin. And in fact, I came from England. I'd just trained as a teacher. I took my first job in Canberra for 6 months and then went to the New South Wales Department of Education. I was a science teacher. I did a lot on ecology. I was interested in endocrinology, all those hard science subjects, well, hard soft. And so coming into Australia was quite a strange experience for me. You know, to begin with, I was fascinated by the trees and the beaches and the kind of amazing animals and colours. But very quickly, particularly, may I add, when I met the New South Wales Department of Education, I started to understand that there were complex social, cultural and political forces at work in Australia that were actually rather different to what I was used to in England. In the country of your birth, it's often hard to see knowledge and authority. You live it. It's just there. You know it. And indeed, when you come to another place where you don't know, that creates a whole set of uncertainties and indeed quests for knowledge, quests to understand. I never migrated to Australia, and so in a sense I speak out of a place that's somewhere in between Australia and Europe, I would say now, not England. I haven't been back to England as much really as I've been to continental Europe. And in some ways I think my roots are more deeply anchored in Northern European traditions of education than in some ways even in English traditions. But those histories, I think, one carries. And so I guess I want to claim the space of speaking out of the in-between. I suspect I'm not alone here in that. And I suspect many of you know the uncertainties and the questions that come with being in between. In between because you've come from different places, in between because of who you are. And those issues, I think, are fundamentally some of the work that we do as educators. What I want to do in this lecture, and I will speed up in a minute, is really try to offer some comments, tell a story if you like, which I think in some ways illustrates Betty's keynote on Tuesday, where she talked about the fact that, you know, we all rush off and read all this stuff and get anxious about theory workshops and things like this. But actually, what it means to be a researcher, what it means to know, what it means to find out how to know, is very much about building words. It's about reading. It's about puzzling. It's about struggling to find a way. I make no bones. I've struggled to find my way. And in fact, what I'd like to do is to try to portray that through this lecture as much as I can. I guess if I've got a big message in this, as well as the message about the importance of education and the educational work that we do, and I use that phrase quite specifically, educational work. My second big message is about disciplines. It seems to me that we reify disciplines too often. We think about them as governing narratives, and I know myself, I often get a bit intimidated when I meet people who are strongly disciplined, because actually they speak in ways that I find quite hard often to grapple with, partly because my own discipline background is complex. I came in the natural sciences, I've moved into the social sciences. I think that's affected how I do research. So for me, discipline is not actually an abstract reification. It's about how I have tried to discipline my practice, how I have disciplined my practice, how I have been disciplined by others in the conversations I have. I think the critical issue for educational research is actually not to struggle so much with theory, to be frank. I actually think it's about understanding disciplinarity in a broad sense, that indeed we come from many places with many knowledge traditions, we operate with many vocabularies. We have to learn to work between and with those. And that's actually the challenge for our field. Theory is important, but I also think understanding the landscape, the knowledge architecture that we work in, and how we're positioned within it is a critical dimension. So what I want to do here, and this is just a quick glimpse, is to try to unpack this idea of 21st century context a little bit. To try to look at this question, where are we now? This is the question that I think I carried, and I've carried with me since I came to Australia. In a way, it's meant that I do a whole range of projects and things because I'm curious about where we are. I want to talk a little bit about the idea or the concept of contexts and to suggest that they are a form of knowledge authority order. And then I want to get to talk a little bit through some projects that I've done, and I might need to squeeze that a bit. But in a sense, my core educational message relates to this issue of the work that we do in analytic borderlands, in the in-between spaces where we are now living, all of us now living, because Australia is no longer just national, if it ever was. And I think there's questions about that. And then I'll try and finish off with some comments on educational research. So let me begin. My point of departure is actually Lynn Yates's Radford address in 2011. I found it quite fascinating reading a number of the Radford addresses over a number of years. They're excellent reading, and I do recommend them to you and your students as a way of getting an understanding of our field of educational knowledge and practice. Lynn's title I thought was really good. My school, my university, my country, my world, my Google, myself. This, for me, captures something about the nature of 21st century contexts, something about the informational nature of these contexts and the kind of breathlessness almost of these contexts. But what I think is really interesting is that Lynn, through this title, poses a really interesting analytical problem for us. How do we understand the notion of education as an institution, a social institution, and the notion of education as a form of activity? What's the relation between education as a governing device and the experience that is governed? These are the questions that I want to try to tease out a little bit today. In the late 2000s, I did a project with colleagues in Germany and Finland, and in fact it was a larger project that had, it was a book project with contributors from also from Germany, Finland, Australia, England and the US. So it was kind of an interesting transnational project, cross-national project. And one of the things that we thought was really interesting was that this sense of 21st century context, the sense of somehow that the world was sliding and slipping in ways that were unpredictable, and the sense of unease was really palpable. Lynn's question, what's the relation between the institution of education and, if you like, the activity or experience of education, I think was fundamental to the kind of book project that we tried to grapple with. In this particular project, we talked with, we were working with people in human service work, nurses, teachers, and social workers, and trying to get an understanding of how they made sense of their own workplaces. And we were really struck by the fact that they, when they first started to talk about their workplaces, the stories that they told were really what I would call grief stories. They were stories about loss. They were stories of pain. They were stories of uncertainty. And in a way, forgive me, but this is what I have heard at this conference too, the grief stories. There's lots else going on, but there's also the grief stories here. You know, that sense that things are moving fast forward, where do they go? But what we tried to do through this particular project was to try to push through those grief stories. And we suggested to people that rather than focusing on the kind of big narratives of, increased migration, job retrenchment, changes in policy and all of those things, we said, tell us about the politics. Tell us about the politics. How did you negotiate these complex global transformations that were going on? What did you do? How did your people in your workplace deal with this stuff? And we used Richard Sennett's ideas there, where he talks in The Corrosion of Character about the way flexible capitalism creates an illegible regime of power, that within workplaces people can't make sense of things that used to work this way, but now they work that way. Where do we go with this? And so we use this term transforming politics as a way of trying to get behind the kind of standard narratives, if you like, of transforming disturbing work and the grief stories that went with it. And if you look at this slide, you'll see that to begin with, there's a lot about the kind of grief that came through that study. But as you move down that slide, what we found was that people were negotiating in all sorts of complex ways to actually find ways of moving forward. What we thought was particularly interesting was, first of all, that notion that indeed their activities in terms of transforming politics was very much about boundary work. It was about where the boundaries were, who defined the boundaries, what was included and excluded. But we also found that what was really interesting about these people working in these different workplaces in 5 different countries, so this is not a personal trouble, this is a public issue we're talking about here, was this idea that these folk were able to act because they could say we. This term we, I think, is really critical, and in fact in the Sennett book, he talks about we as a dangerous pronoun. We is a dangerous pronoun, but it's a pronoun that educators and education has always mediated, or at least for a long time. 21st century context then, when I look at the educational literature, what I find is a set of references to context that I find quite problematic. Bill Mulford's paper in the International Encyclopedia of Education, great volume if you haven't looked at it yet, is really, really good value and I think has some great things to say. But he uses this term, you can see 2/3 of the way down, successful educational leadership involves being contextually literate, organisationally savvy and leadership smart. My question is, what does that mean? What is contextual literacy in slippery, slidey times? And how do we get hold of this? So what I want to do now is just give you some feeling for the this concept of context. Some of you may know that when I first came to Australia, I did puddle around the context question a wee bit and wrote a paper in 1986 where I tried to unpack the different epistemologies that sat underneath this word. It was good fun and it was an interesting task to do, partly because it helped me understand the idea of different epistemologies and their effects, their governing effects, if you like, on practice and on knowledge. But when I look at the kind of representations of context that I see, for example, in the International Encyclopedia, and this is obviously not all of it, what I see is Bill Mulford's version, which is the egg version. You know, that what we have to do to be contextually literate is to look at the school context, look at the school workplace, and look at the practices within the school. Now, clearly one of the dilemmas with this kind of model is that it presumes that the school is the context, that that's sufficient, that the boundary around the school is sufficient. A bit like saying the boundary around Australia is sufficient to understand Australian education. That's never been the case. So this idea that a kind of ascription of a boundary creates a world, a place to be, is quite complicated. The other limitation with the Mulford model is, of course, that it makes an assumption that the context is kind of layered on or matches up entirely with the actual physical space. Yet we know schools are never hermetically sealed. There's communities, there's networks, there's all sorts of stuff crossing the boundaries and the borders of the school. And so clearly, the whole question of being contextually literate within these bounded spaces is really problematic. The second model that you can see there is from another great article in that encyclopedia by Mike Bottery, who talks about 21st century context, and he makes the point that so many people in education just focus on the context as a kind of national context or school context or so on, and his argument is that we really must look at the global context. And he argues that, in fact, we're already leaving the world in a mess for the next generation, and if we don't tackle the global context too, it's going to be even worse. I really like his argument. But what's interesting about the way he actually presents this idea of context is that he uses these categories: micro-context, meso-context, macro-context, and then global context. I've separated them because actually each of those top three contexts that he talks about are narrated through a sociological discourse. It's very much about the interaction and the activity that's going on within the school, within the wider society. When he comes to talk about the global context, he switches discourse, he switches to a political discourse. And the way that then portrays the global is of this rather remote, rather austere, rather separate, hard world of politics and policy. The implication of this discursive separation is, of course, that it seems as if the macro, meso and micro have no political order, and it makes it seem as if the global has no sociality. This is ridiculous, because clearly every social space has both a governing regime and a set of socialities, and it's those intersections that are really important. And in many, many respects, the whole issue about socialities, the whole issue about societies, about us, is that we make our form of governing. We produce our form of governance. Not individually, but basically, how we govern ourselves is the big question that we're trying to grapple with at the moment. And to me, that's the crux of 21st century contexts. My own take on context has always been a bit kind of messier, I guess you'd call it. Coming to Australia, where do you start to look to make sense of a world you don't know? I looked at ecology, I looked at all sorts of different things. What I did through my doctorate was to look at particular theorists, Bernstein, Michael Young, focusing on knowledge and authority, people like Marx, people like Frigga Haug, feminists. And basically those texts, those readings helped to discipline my practice. I would call the approach that I've used and continue to use a civilisational approach. It's a bit grand, but it's quite nice because it gives me lots of licence to go to places and to see things and to look for understanding in lots of different ways. And this throws up all sorts of complex questions. I guess the crux of my understanding is rooted in historical sociology. I would name it. I think it's useful to name these traditions because I can see then who I am standing on as I speak here today. And I think there are two themes there. First of all, the idea that a civilisational complex is all of the stuff, the society, the culture, the polity, the religion, and the economy that ordinarily envelop human beings throughout their lives. So this sense of enveloping is really what I've found fascinating in my work. And I think the other key insight from historical sociology that I want to put on the table is the idea that we make histories. Others have said it before me, much better probably than me. But the quote that I like is from a guy called Abrams, who is an American. He says, historical sociology about the making of societies, What people do in the present is a struggle to create a future out of the past, of seeing that the past is not just the womb of the present, but the only raw materials out of which the present, I'd say, and the future can be constructed. The way I think about context is to think about them these days, if you like, as spaces of orientation. I've tried to disaggregate this idea of contexts, to think about the nature of spatialisation, space and place, and its ordering through forms of territory and processes of territorialisation, deterritorialisation and reterritorialisation. That tradition comes out of sociology and political geography. But I've also tried to learn how to deal with words and to try to think about the significance of language, of epistemologies, of knowledge, of discourse within the contextualisation process. It seems to me when we're talking about context, we're talking about both. And how they line up is often complex. So my current understanding is that contexts are actually where we bring together place, the stories so far, problematics, forms of reasoning, logic, concepts and vocabularies. And out of that we produce platforms for action. If we tell grief stories all the time using those big abstract discourses, we will always have grieving platforms for action. I kind of think for me, this is something that I think is important to try to unpack a wee bit more. So I want to try now to talk through some projects, partly to illustrate what I mean by this idea of spaces of orientation. And this diagram is slightly complicated, but in a way it's trying to say that socialities, social orders, people use their historical memory to make the spaces and the places in which we work. And we know that states, through that work, through that making of presents and futures, that what we do is we generate forms of governing practice that actually enable us to live civilised lives, live together, and to grumble all the time about what governments do. And so this relation between social formation and governing practice is the nature of every space, whether it's a family, whether it's a school, whether it's a nation, whether it's the world, whether it's an individual. Oh, Jiminy Cricket, okay? What I think is interesting about the nature of education is, of course, that it's one of the social institutions that's produced through the interplay between socialities and states, between the sedimentation of historical memory in highly ordered ways, highly unequal ways, by and large, and how that complex geometry of power plays out in forms of governing. I think I say this because for me it's really important to remember that education has never been a soft and nice place. Education has always been a means of governing. We soften it. It is an institution of soft power, but is nevertheless governing in all sorts of complex ways. In my doctorate, I did some research on New South Wales secondary education, looking at the changes in the restructuring that went on through the 1930s depression. It's quite interesting to see in the detail of the policies and the ministerial reports and other texts to see how, in fact, the selectivity to teaching increased in the depths of depression. You could see it getting stronger and stronger. By the time they'd got to 1931 or so, they'd already excluded anybody that was left-handed, anybody that wasn't of a certain kind of bearing, those who couldn't obviously meet the grades. There was a whole range of cultural characteristics and selection practices that were put in place. The closing off of access to education in the 30s was very, very striking. as was the innovations at that time too. There were a whole range of innovations, including things like the development of the Gowrie Centres, the first Sydney I Stedford, all sorts of things that came on at that time as well. What I also found interesting was the significant growth in the police role of schools during the 30s Depression, in that period of crisis when, of course, Lang got thrown out of office as Premier. For example, teachers were authorised to act as constables should the need arise. And indeed there were instructions to teachers about how to recognise different forms of gun. There were certain guns that were acceptable in Australia or in New South Wales at that time, but larger guns, and I think things like Gatling guns and things like that were indeed not acceptable. And indeed teachers were asked to do the policing in their communities around this stuff. I say to you, education has always been a governing institution. What education has done, of course, and how it's been made, is that it has been contextualised nationally by national communities, national societies and their complex and unequal social orders. And the work by David Hamilton, some of you may know, he's looked at the formation of education since the 12th century. And indeed, in that study, he makes some very interesting comments about the formation of education as a governing device, but also in terms of the formation of its workforce. And that's what I find really interesting. This idea that indeed education is about making citizens, I think is really important. And it seems to me that we do form identities, but in a sense, the identities that we form are not just skilled at work. They're not just able to live together, but they also are inducted into ways of using power responsibly. And that this is a critical dimension of the work that we do. What Hamilton argues, of course, is that through this period, this long, long period from the 11th century, which already built on a long, long period of education organised through churches and through earlier forms of Greek political education, what you find is that it is socialisation and teachings that become the major means of enabling that learning. I think it's interesting that these days we talk about teachings, we don't talk about socialisation. In a globally mobile world, socialisation becomes much more complicated. But that is, of course, one of the reasons why education is under pressure at the moment. And the question of how we do socialisation and how we de-socialise ourselves in order to teach and learn and research for global times, I think is part of the question we face in education research. I like the works of Arendt, the idea that citizens are distinctive because as citizens we use our power to act through words, persuasion and not through violence. For me, citizenship is really important, and this idea of civil identities and the capacity to act, but act through words and not violence is important. The effect of this system of schooling, of course, produced a lay public. Safati Larsen does a lovely job on this one, talking about the way the lay public was informed because it acquired knowledge about the world and also came to know the authorised rules of civilised conduct, of authorised discourse, how knowledge and authority can be read in practice in the world. This lay public was also lay because even though they got some schooling, those kids, those adults, the authority that was conferred on them through their credential was limited in a whole range of ways, not just by their own ability, but indeed by the way they were structured and positioned within the authority structure, within the codes of discourse of the governing regime. Of course, since the 90s, particularly 80s, 90s, what we've seen is a remarkable recontextualisation of education. And I call it a recontextualisation because it seems to me that while the places in some ways are the same, and certainly there's a lot of change that's happened in schools, it has been in some ways a complex re-spatialisation of the educational function, if you like, on a grand scale. It's also been narrated very differently, of course, shifting away from the psychological and sociological traditions of 20th century education, which actually privilege notions of nation building, towards notions that are premised much more on a psychological economic logic, which of course privileges individuals. Margaret Thatcher's "there is no such thing as society" had effects, but so did the big arguments about global knowledge economy. And both of these, both the re-spatialisation of education, so that we don't think about schooling any longer just in terms of schools, but indeed in terms of higher education, in terms of vocational education, in terms of workplace learning, in terms of community settings, in terms of social webs, and in terms of transnational and international projects and initiatives. This re-spatialisation of education means that the world of education has become complex and hard to read. But what we see is that it is being coordinated through these economic psychological logics and their social technologies, which actually create governing devices within that space. What we are dealing with, I think, with the lifelong learning educational order, you could say, is indeed the construction of a globally distributed skills supply chain. A big kind of edifice that means that indeed kids can come from school into learning, into earning, through their credential, and off they go into the world. And of course people can come back whenever they like, because that skilling is going on all the time. The effect of this kind of logic, this kind of reform, I think, is to create what I would call a liquid learning world. A learning world where indeed we're driven by travelling policies that come from elsewhere and are not just generated within the national space. We're driven too by the endorsement by government to learn, to learn, to learn. And so we learn like a treadmill all through our lives. We drive ourselves into the ground as we learn and learn and learn, and we get exhausted and we keep on learning. Joanna Wynn's got this fabulous phrase, this is all about perpetual learning. And I think that's a great way of capturing this sense of breathless but ongoing struggle to learn and learn and learn. Instead of saying, what do I know? What can I stand on? How can I make sense of the world from where I stand, from where I look and see? The third element in this idea of liquid learning, policy, perpetual learning. The third element is precisely the informationalism that we're in. The old architecture of knowledge based on disciplines? Gee, it's a bit on the edge at the moment, isn't it? The architecture of knowledge is increasingly is Google search engines. And it's really interesting that the Europeans are just in the process of actually putting boundaries around Europe in terms of Google search routines, which drive search, drive knowledge, drive information in certain directions. So I think this three-layer structure is what we're trying to understand here. Through the 90s, I did a whole heap of projects looking at VET. Well, in fact, it was the transition from TAFE to VET. I started off in TAFE, looking at doing ethnographic work in TAFE, and then went on, as the system changed, as the training market came into place, to track the effects of changing policies, market reform, competency-based training, credentials, qualifications, frameworks, all of those sorts of things, on the teachers and managers in those places. What we found in our data was that there was, as you'd expect, an enormous diffraction of the educational workforces there. Some really got revved up and enthusiastic, and I can still remember one associate director telling me about an international contract that they'd just done. Others were in deep grief. There was a bunch of teachers at this particular institute who claimed the title of dinosaur, and in fact they had pictures of dinosaur, Tyrannosaurus rex, up on their doors to claim the fact that they were true believers in public education and in all the things that education did for kids and for their communities. And of course, TAFE in Australia is enormously dispersed across age ranges and across regions. But in between those two, there were many, many, many more people who were, in a sense, trying to navigate new ways forward. And it was those people that I thought were, in some ways, the most interesting. Oh, God. All right, I'm going to have to hurry up. So a lot of my work has been very focused on these things. Let me buzz on. We are in de- and re-territorialised spaces. I was interested that Bob the other day talked about the fact that Australia was losing its, Bob Lingard this is, losing its sovereignty in terms of policy. I think we can think about it this way, but we can also think about the supranational space that we are now a part of. Think about the world as an archipelago of national spaces within a larger supranational space. And I think it's really interesting that we see much more in the educational literature about the nasty OECD than in fact we do about the UN. And there are kind of interesting questions about why that should be. What is it about those governing regimes? We are very affected by the OECD, but in some ways, I'm not sure that we look quite so much at things like the UN. One of the problems with this kind of issue, this kind of re-spatialisation of education, is of course that it disrupts the terminology that we're used to using. We don't talk about schools, we talk about what? Lifelong learning. We talk about lifelong learning spaces. We also don't talk about teachers, because if you're working in industry, the term teacher doesn't wash very well. You may well be a trainer, you may well be a manager, but you may well still be doing educational work. And so for me, this question of what is educational in these shifting spaces became a really important question to ask. What was it about private training providers? What was it about social webs and supranational spaces that actually was still educational? And in what sense did those educators, and they were educators, still make citizens, still make civil identities with citizen capabilities? I want to disaggregate it that way because I think it's helpful. And so what I've been doing, and I'm jumping a little bit, partly through work in the vet sector and its immense range of learning spaces, but partly also through work, for example, in Kazakhstan, where I was involved in a project and saw the introduction of PISA, or the proposal that Kazakhstan should go to PISA, and how that diffracted and divided the different, they were language groups, but in fact social groups within the Kazakh education system. Looking also in Europe and seeing how across Europe, and there are different strategies that are playing out in terms of responding to the educational imperatives of organisations like the OECD. But of course with Europe it's interesting because we're not just dealing with the governmental governing practices, if you like, of the OECD, the social technologies like PISA that are used to govern education. But indeed in Europe we're dealing with a formalised state, a form of state that is now a supranational state. This means that the space of Europe is no longer national in all sorts of ways. It is both global and national. And so that idea of how we, either through the effects of PISA or travelling policies, but particularly in Europe, through the formation of a supranational state form, are now living in global national borderlands is a critical question. I've been trying to make sense of what it is about educational work in those different places. And to do this, I've been building on the teacher's work literature, but then trying to translate it and re-spatialise it. It's been an interesting process. But it seems to me that what's critical in terms of the educational work that we do, I do, others do all over the place, is that we make spaces of encounter, spaces where indeed civility can be both modelled and learned. We construct platforms by mobilising knowledge resources, different epistemologies and so on. Platforms for looking. The right to look is all. We can then think about how we interpret. Through this educational work, we open up access to a whole range of different knowledge traditions, if you like. But what I would prefer to call, following Margaret Summers' work, the idea of sedimented and authorised vocabularies, the kind of conceptual narratives and ontological and public narratives within which we live our lives. And it seems to me that in all of those places, wherever I've been to see this educational work in action, what struck me is this sense of tough love. You know, it's a kind of deep, intense, individualised attention, coupled with a sense of care and support. And there's a wonderful book by Gaiman Metcalfe, who looked at Australian teachers, and they argue that the roots of this particular relationality is actually deeply rooted in church traditions and the idea of an I-thou relation. That when we teach, in fact, we are not transmitting, we are not delivering, we are indeed finding a way with our students. We are finding a way to a place of grace. And I think some of these sacro-magical themes are really important dimensions of what we're talking about. My argument then is that in these new learning spaces that we are living with every day, these global national, which is intrinsic to where we are right now, all of us, what we see are new forms of civility emerging. And I think what's really interesting is the idea that the formation, for example, of Europe as a supranational state space, you can see how it is no longer based just on tradition or just on goodwill. It is fundamentally a learning process as people try to break with the past, move on and deal with the world, make a future that is more civil in many respects, but deals with the issues we have. It seems to me that under the national education system and under forms of public education, what we have is a territorialising device. Very effective, very good. It was premised very much on socialisation and teaching, and teachers' work was substantially about socialisation. Teaching was the professionalising strategy. I think what's really interesting when we come to the kind of current empty word environment that we live in, we see all these terms like skills, competencies, capabilities, all the rest of it. And we hear about the kind of the focus on instruction, even rather than teaching. But I think we have a choice at this point. We can either treat these words, these forms of discourse, these technologies of control as governing abstractions, or we can treat them as spaces for translation, spaces where we can do work. And that's certainly some of the work that I see happening in Europe, in teaching experiments that are going on all over the place, and I'm sure they're happening here too. It seems to me that what's added in, interestingly, in contemporary educational work is indeed this idea of how we form transnational civilities. This is more than intercultural learning. It is something deeply ontological, and it's about how we navigate that. It's deeply ontological in personal senses. It's deeply anchored in knowledge traditions in social and national senses. Which way for education research? And I've run out of time. Sorry, guys. So let me make just a couple of comments. I have got some other thoughts. I was looking back to the AARE ACDE project in relation to thinking about where do we go with that project now. I think it's really important to try to push that a bit further. We tried to look behind the 2.2 world marker or symbol that we were told through Aare 2010 to say what was it that was going on in our community of knowledge and practice, our networks. And I think some of that research was useful and offered provocative ways of thinking forward. But it seems to me that what I need to say quickly is that I think fundamentally to this question of educational research, we have to think about the unit of reference. Are we in educational research just looking at the national? It seems to me often in the discourse of education that's what happened, it defaults to the national. But actually it seems to me that we are, in Australia, actually not really national. Really the critical jurisdictions are still states in many respects, and there's this kind of constant battle. But we also know that there's an enormous amount of complexity when we look at the invisibilised nations that have inhabited Australia for much, much, much longer than we have as white Australians. And so I ask, what is the unit of reference? Because indeed all three of these images are also limited because they don't capture the global. They don't capture the way that every one of these spaces, every one of these representations is both global and national. And we are in the middle trying to negotiate. We are looking for ways forward. Where are we? How do we move forward? What is education's contribution? As I said at the beginning, the critical issue for me is not about this theory or that. We use these different readings and resources and vocabularies to discipline our practice as best we can. We muddle through. That's certainly been my experience. I make no great claims about it. But what's critical, I think, is that we understand disciplinarity, the landscape of knowledge, the landscape of knowledge traditions, that we understand that whenever I speak or you speak, we speak on behalf of a tradition. We have obligations to that tradition, and we have obligations to try and take it forward as conditions change. That means generating new concepts, new vocabularies, and in a way that's why this work is really exciting. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Terry, for carrying on the fine tradition of wonderful Radford lectures. That was tremendous. And it's wonderful to be challenged and to think through our own work. There's an award that we present to Terry for the lecture. So I'll just grab that. So the Radford lecture is one of the major awards of the association, and as I said in the introduction, it is presented to a distinguished scholar who's made a significant contribution to research in Australia. And Terry, the award. Thanks. Present. So can I introduce Annette Woods and Amanda Keddy, or Amanda, is it, or both of you, who are going to present some further awards. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name's Amanda Keddy from the University of Queensland. It's my great pleasure this morning to present the Early Career Researcher Award. Aare established this award to encourage early career researchers to present their research at the annual conference and to become actively involved in the association, as the intent of the award is to honour and facilitate outstanding scholarship. Applications are judged on the basis of the following academic merit criteria: originality, contemporary significance, conceptual, methodological and theoretical soundness, disciplined, focused and persuasive argument, coherent organisation and clarity of written expression, and comprehensive reference to appropriate literature. Members of Aare Awards panel involved in the decision and providing feedback for the winner of this award commented that it was timely, the argument was well theorised, and the committee was impressed by the use of data and the level of sophistication achieved in the application of theory to analysis. It gives me great pleasure to call Hannah Sung to the front to collect the Early Career Researcher Award for her paper entitled The Imagination of Mobility, Windows into Australian Teacher Education as a Site of Transnational Lifeworlds Negotiations. Hannah.
Dear distinguished guests and friends, thank you for this great honor. I want to thank the review panel and the panel's convener, Associate Professor Annette Woods, for the hard work they have put into their deliberations. It cannot have been easy to decide with so many worthy candidates. I am profoundly honored and humbled to receive this award in the company of esteemed colleagues here and scholars and ongoing contributions in the field of education. My thesis, which I think this award is in recognition of, is concerned with the global flow of student-migrant mobility through higher education. My research tracked the stories of 7 international pre-service teachers over 2 years and discovered that their role as pre-service teachers becoming migrant teachers in Australia was not what I and they had expected it would be. Much of their journey to become migrant teachers was based on an imagined version of Australia as a historical and conceptual space of the West. This discovery developed my interest in the effects of social imagination on the global mobility of potential migrants. It is also about my individual process of becoming. Like my subjects, I find myself being shaped by the experiences which are located in the complex intersections of the shifting forces of globalization, educational practices, and our struggle for a form of legitimacy in a host country, which, when I hear Terry spoke so much, it just resonates with my individual experience as well as my research. The completion of my doctorate represents a new stage in my life, where I now seek to make my mark by contributing what I've learned back into the community, whether that is at local, regional, or global level. I'm now writing a book about experiences in Australian international education at a complicated nexus of migration policy and the myths and realities of student-migrant mobility in our times. But unlike the Singaporean teachers that our Professor David Hogan has spoken about in his keynote speech, that Singapore teachers regard knowledge as absolute truth, I would like to differ from that and speak from Sigmund Freud in his book Civilization and Its Discontent, where he said, "I became aware of my destiny to belong to the critical minority as opposed to the unquestioning majority." This is important, especially for early career researchers like myself and many others who are here, who I've communicated and conversed with. And I think the AARE and nzare community represents this critical minority. And thank you so much, Terry, for your work too. This environment is vital to us becoming critical scholars, because we live in times of great economic, social, and cultural change. The challenge for us is to turn the insights of Freud into action. To end, even though Albert Camus, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist, may be right to say that our lives are the sum of our choices, the choices of others, including your generosity with this award, including my colleagues and my friends at UniSA, your professional and support. I would like to particularly name 2 persons who has been there all the while from the beginning of my work in UniSA, who has always been giving me the support and becoming the person that I am today, and I hope to continue to grow with them, is Bill Lucas and Robert Hapton. Thank you so much for being there for me. It is a special moment for me, and I would like to thank you all. Thank you so much.
We're nearly there, I promise. I'd like to start saying thank you to you as an audience. Being a past recipient of a Aare award many years ago as a doctoral student, and that does seem now in a time that was a very, very long time ago. However, despite those fading memories, as a result of ageing, obviously, I do actually remember just how significant it is or how significant it was to be recognised by what I saw as my association. I think it's really, really important for us to remember that. There's nothing quite like breakfasting, as I was lucky enough to do this morning with the conference award or awardees for this year, to just be reminded of what it is to have a really strong enthusiasm for the research that you're doing. And it's an amazing experience to actually see that regularly. But I think what it reminds us of, and I thank you for your respectful approach to this, reminds us of just how important it is to stop, to reflect, to rejoice, and to support our excellent emerging and our excellent researchers. So thank you for, as an audience, for remembering that the coffee will stay there for an extra 5 or 10 minutes, that you will still be fed, and thank you for your respectful approach to our awards throughout this week. I appreciate that, and I know that the awardees also appreciated that and felt that support. So I'm here today to present the final of the conference awards for Aare. This, in fact, is entitled the ACDE, so the Australian Council of Deans of Education Early Career Researcher and Postgraduate Student Poster Award. We judge this award each year at the conference, obviously, because it's judged on the presentation of the posters. So each year, the Australian Council of Deans in Education partners with Aare to award either an early career researcher or a postgraduate student with this award to mark the best poster presented by this cohort at the Aare annual conference each year. The posters are judged by 4 merit criteria: the content of the poster, the clarity and interest of presentation, the theoretical and methodological bases and findings that are presented in the poster, and the presentation of quality discussion points and conclusions. You can imagine how much fun it is to judge this award. And I think it's very significant that ACDE partners with Aare. I think it's significant because I think it actually shows that our Council of Deans of Education see the importance of this association and of our emerging researchers, and I think that's a good thing. Now, this year the field was not only strong, it was very broad and very wide. We had more applicants than we've ever had before, which was wonderful. And the conference committee deliberated, and after a great deal of discussion, decided upon the awardee for 2014. It gives me a great deal of pleasure for the poster entitled Mandatory Sleep Practices for Early Childhood Education and Care Settings, Implications for Children's Nighttime Sleep, to ask Sally Staton to come down to the front to receive her award. Sorry? Yep, about to do that. I'll now call... certainly.
Thank you. We're still getting used to the formalities. So there's one last award, and it's a really important award. It's for the best paper in the Australian Educational Researcher. So I'd like to invite Nick Melchior from Springer and Linda Graham to come and present this award. Thank you.
So the Best Paper Award in Australian Educational Researcher, and in case you didn't know, I'm the editor of the journal and have been since the beginning of this year, or end of last year. The award criteria is the same as the Early Career Researcher Award. So each of the papers that were published in 2014, of which there were 33, actually take 2 off because there was mine and Jill Blackmore's Radford. I didn't think that was fair to include her in there. Sorry, Jill. So each of them were judged by me in a kind of first cull against these 6 criteria, and I came up with a short list of 5, which I asked a panel of editorial board members and associate editors to then rate on a 5-point scale. And we ended up with these 5 finalists. And there were some really, really great papers in AER, but what I was looking for in particular was that significance and the contribution to knowledge and the originality and strong methodological approaches and original findings and whatnot. And so out of these 5 papers, there was, in the end, a clear winner. And that winner was Sue Cray from University of Queensland.
No, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed, and I am actually really overwhelmed. Thank you to Springer, thank you to AER for recognising my writing. I didn't want to make a big speech. I know it happened on Tuesday, and I don't want you all to, I know coffee's calling, but I do want to say to you, you don't need to read the thesis now, just read the paper. Put it in a Christmas card to your favourite policymaker and send it to them. It is a big problem, that category, a really big problem, particularly for our refugee background children who need a lot of help with their education, and will be assets to our community if we support them. There's just some people, I want to thank the reviewers. I don't know who you were, but this was actually my first solo published paper, and when you get those review comments back, it's like, oh, God. But my Professor Mark Weston, who was my statistical professor, helped me, and I want to acknowledge his help too. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I really encourage you to download and read Sue's paper? I was so impressed with it, and it's on a really, really important topic. And it'd be wonderful if we could send Akara, the paper and say, your La Boat category sucks. The other thing is that Springer has very generously said that each of these 5 finalist papers will be available via free access until the 15th of January. So trust me, they're all worth a read. And I've got one more announcement, which is that next year we are going to have another award. And the prize that Sue gets, in case, by the way, Sue, that you didn't realise, there's a $500 cheque that comes with the doorstop. So, or paperweight as it might be. So we're having a Best Reviewer Award. So you have a chance to win every time you receive a request to review from me. You go in the draw. But seriously, I actually do really want to, in this year, there have been major changes to AER, and the review process is now actually very quick, and I have you all out there to thank for that. And if you do not yet review for AER, please come and talk to me. Thanks.